I've heard what an incredibly eclectic group of topics that you had under this matter rubric, and this is definitely going to be probably even more of a left turn than all that. As you know, I'm a philosopher of mind and a philosopher of physics, and that accounts for the content of this talk. So I'll just apologize for that in advance if you have no interest in that. But I'm going to try to make it as interesting as I can. So you said consciousness, and that's right. And the reason that we have to talk about consciousness when we talk about matter is because how we think about mind or consciousness and how we think about matter each inform one another. And there is a very long history in Western philosophy, and for that matter, in Asia as well, about how to think about mind and matter and how they go together or they don't. So I'm going to start, though. We've got to start somewhere. So I'm going to start with Descartes. I'm going to blame him. There are lots of other people one could blame. But the Meditations. And so I'm beginning by just sort of setting up this problematic about consciousness and matter, right? So basically Descartes says, think of mind as essentially defined by thinking, and he talks about consciousness as well, versus matter as a mechanism. So many people during Descartes' era were both mechanists and atomists. As it happens, Descartes wasn't an atomist, but that's a lot of technical stuff you don't really need to know. What really matters is he was a mechanist, which is to say that he thought that unperturbed by mind, matter would obey its own natural laws and would autonomously unfold as it would. So the words like mechanism have changed radically over time historically, but so that was the idea. So we have very different things here, right? And they have varied, and he thinks of matter as being essentially extended. You know this story. So we have these essences, and they're very different, and this, of course, creates the classic mind-body problem. So as many people have put it over the years, so if we think that brains are somehow what's essential to producing consciousness, how does this, wet and gooey gray and white stuff that's just chemically electrified meat produce something as amazing as our conscious experience? So that's one way to pitch the problem. Okay, so what happens over time? And I'm skipping a lot of time here. Thinking, right, this feature of minds that we call thinking or intentionality or cognition, that gets shelved under what Descartes would have thought as a mechanism. And the way that that has happened, at least since the middle of the 20th century, is the sort of computationalist paradigm. So the idea, which these people took very seriously, that the brain was the hardware and the mind was the software, so that this computer thing is not just a metaphor, but they really want to take this idea very seriously. And obviously, many of you know that in every era, when people are doing science, they borrow whatever the coolest new technology is and use that as a metaphor for how they're going to explain something. So nothing different going on there. So that's the mechanism story. And then consciousness gets swept under the rug until the late 20th century. And of course, here I'm primarily pointing at behaviorism. Well, what happens? Consciousness won't stay hidden. It comes back, and it comes back as the hard problem. And so the hard problem of consciousness, again, is just this mind-body problem, but now focused not so much on intentionality or cognition, which many people are still hoping is going to get accounted for in some mechanical way. You've seen a lot of this lately in the press, right? So AI is all hot again, and we're seeing all this hype about how great AI is and how good it's going to be in the very near future. That's the idea, right? That the thinking, the cognition stuff will all be dealt with mechanically, but now we have this leftover problem, consciousness or experience. And as David Chalmers, maybe the king of the hard problem in philosophy, at least recently points out, you need something like materialism or physicalism, so we're getting into that matter thing, as a background to worry, to care about the hard problem. So he says you need the background of materialism to get the hard problem off the ground. Well, what do we mean by materialism or physicalism? That's a philosophical term of art, which I'm not going to bore you with at any great length. But basically the idea is that matter is fundamental, and matter is essentially non-mental. Whatever else it may be, We don't necessarily think of it as essentially extended anymore, but we do think of it as essentially non-mental. And if you think that it's fundamental and you think it's essentially non-mental, well then where does consciousness come from? So in particular, as I told you before, the computationalism paradigm is, at the level of cognitive science and neuroscience, how we think about that mechanical view of thinking and cognition. Okay, so we're some sort of computer. Maybe not the sort that's on your desktop, maybe not a universal Turing machine, maybe some sort of neural network, but that's the idea. So that, for many people in cognitive science, this is still the paradigm about cognition, though I think that's changing. Long story we'll get to, maybe. But in terms of consciousness, the reigning paradigm at the moment is that we are seeking the neural correlate of conscious experience. So what does that mean? That means that we're going to get out our fMRI machines and our divining rods and whatever else they're using. Maybe I telegraph too much what I think about fMRI. Or I'm a fan of, yeah. But anyway, and we're going to try to find some global neural state or some local neural state that corresponds to each state of consciousness, like vision or hearing or whatever, and that this is supposed to be a sufficient condition for the conscious state in question. Long story short, we have discovered no such thing. I mean, I don't want to rule out the possibility that we could. Maybe the technology sucks. Maybe it'll all get better. But we haven't. And as you'll see, people are getting neuroscientists are getting a little nervous about it. But here's the point for now. If you think of, once you separate intentionality and conscious experience, or thinking and conscious experience on the one hand, then what has happened historically is you get this picture about conscious experience, again, a philosophical term of art, qualia. So qualia are like these intrinsic tropes of conscious experience, like seeing red or feeling pain, okay? And now somehow, while AI and neuroscience might completely explain all of our cognitive abilities, we're stuck with this other problem. And the other problem is, well, how are we going to, even if we nail all that and everybody gets a Nobel Prize and we build, great AI that's just like us, except for the qualia part, how are we going to explain qualia? How are we going to explain these tropes of conscious experience? So this is Montero. I believe you're going to be visited by her in the not-too-distant future. So I picked this quote. Again, this problem all stems from thinking as matter is essentially non-mental. So if instead of construing the mind-body problem as finding a place for mentality in a fundamentally physical world, we should think of it as the problem of finding a place for mentality in a fundamentally non-mental world, a world that at its most fundamental level is entirely non-mental. So you see the problem, right? If you think of matter that way, and you think matter is fundamental, as many, many philosophers and scientists do these days, then you're going to be stuck with one really hard problem. Where does consciousness come from? So there's a dilemma. Well, you either try to account for the mental with this non-mental phenomena, or the mental, or somehow your original supposition must be wrong, and somehow the mental must be fundamental, right? And, but even if we can explain thinking mechanistically, and I believe that's more and more of a dubious proposition, because I am somebody who defends embodied cognition and extended cognition. I reject computationalism. Maybe we'll have time to get to that. But even if you believe that, how are we going to explain conscious experience that way, right? So on the one side of the equation, we have feeling and experience and all of that stuff that those of you that haven't already fallen asleep are having right now. And on the other side of the equation, we have, brain stuff. So there's just no way that consciousness can be reduced. That's the way scientists and philosophers talk about it. That's often allegedly how scientific explanation works, not so much in reality. There's no way we can reduce conscious experience to neural activity, right? What would it even mean? One is subjective, right? And first person, and the other is purely material, chemical, and third person. So it's a non-starter. It's a non sequitur of a sort, a category mistake. Okay, so this hard problem that David Chalmers and Joseph Levine and other people started talking about, right? Yeah, some people are laughing. No, there's no pun there. So this hard problem, these people started talking about in the 80s and 90s. Everybody, the neuroscience was sort of like, I mean, you've seen plenty of this in the press. They're like, okay, philosophers, you've been talking about matter and mind and all this stuff for 2,000 years, but hey, now we got it. The science is habit. You're cool. Go away. Go work at McDonald's or whatever you're going to do now because your day is over, right? We're going to answer this scientifically. So you can worry about the hard problem if you want for now, but neuroscience is going to fix this. Well, it's 2015, and they haven't fixed it. And so even hard-nosed neuroscientists of the sort that you would never, ever imagine taking some alternative to reductionism or materialism or what we call the mind-brain identity theory are doing that. That's how you know they're scared, right? So when scientists engage philosophers or they start moving to philosophical, they even start engaging in philosophy at all, they're freaked out because they don't want to do that. So, and the two sort of positions that they've gravitated to, which is inexplicable to me, but never mind, one is called strong or radical emergence and the other is called panpsychism. Again, these are technical terms of art. So what do they mean? Well, and by the way, strong emergence has a long history. A philosopher named C.D. Broad is probably most famously associated with it. Before the success of quantum mechanics, for example, there were philosophers who, or before the success of Darwinian biology and Watson and Crick and all that stuff, there were people who said, well, yeah, physics can account for a lot of physical stuff, but of course this is pre-20th century, or at least it goes away in the 20th century, 19th century. They said, but physics will never be able to explain. There'll be no reductive explanation of things like life and mind, right? So, they talked about life in terms of elan vital and all these sort of things, which is sort of like the force, but bio-y or whatever. No, real historians could tell you what it really meant. But you get the idea. And then comes Darwin, and then comes DNA, and you can imagine that elan vital did not last very long after that. Well, now we're at mind. Okay. So people often associate strong emergence with an anti-scientific or spooky kind of view, but it is coming back strong with respect at least to consciousness. And it says that under the right conditions, such as the existence of certain brain states, conscious experience comes into existence, thus requiring a new brute, term of art, metaphysically basic and fundamental law of nature. So the idea here is, okay, even if the physicists come up with a theory of everything that marries quantum mechanics and gravity, and I know you want to hear more about that, and they can derive all these things on the basis of that, if strong emergence is right, there's going to be one thing they don't get out of. There's going to have to be some fundamental law that can't be reduced or accounted for in any other terms that correlates or relates brains or physics with conscious states. That's the idea. That's going to be a permanent fundamental feature of our reality. Another possibility that people are excited about, again, this is a very old idea, too old for me to even go into the history of, but it's probably most closely associated with Whitehead. Panpsychism is another possibility, and it says that mentality, or proto-mentality, right, whatever that means, inheres as an intrinsic property in fundamental physical entities such as particles. So the idea is, okay, all right, I guess we're going to have to concede, given the hard problem, that consciousness really is fundamental, but maybe we don't have to be like dualists or say anything like really creepy. So we'll say this. We'll say that we'll try to be atomists about it. So there are these atoms of experience, and they're not fully fledged minds or qualia, but they're proto-qualia, and they adhere somehow in fundamental physical entities. And somehow that just gets combined, just like, atoms make up chairs. So these things are combined. You can see I'm not at all prejudiced against this. I'm trying to give you a very objective characterization. And they combine to make minds. Okay. So now I put the slide here just to, in case you think I'm bullshitting you about scientists going for this stuff. So here's a quote. This is Christoph Koch. Maybe you know who he is. Maybe the world's most famous neuroscientist. Certainly, colleague of Crick's, certainly inclined to be a reductionist, and gets a lot of money for being one. And this is Wired magazine, and this is an interview. And the Wired interviewer says, how did you come to believe in panpsychism? Now, of course, you would expect him to go, what? You know, but that's not what he says. He doesn't deny it, right? He says, well, there's a theory called integrated information theory, developed by Tonini at the University of Wisconsin, that assigns to any one brain or any complex system a number, denoted by the Greek symbol of phi, that tells you how integrated a system is, how much more the system is than the union of its parts. Phi gives you an information theoretic measure of consciousness. Any system with integrated information different from zero has consciousness. Ooh, right? This might make Leibniz blush. So notice two moves here to notice. One is, this is an information theoretic account of consciousness. There ain't anything about brains or wet stuffs or neurons in this passage, right? So in other words, this is what philosophers, not in the William James sense, but in the Hilary Putnam sense, used to call functionalism, right? If we get the right sort of integration of information, and I won't bore you with what that means for these people, but it's an equation, no matter what the stuff is that is so integrated, then to whatever degree or another that it realizes phi, it's going to be conscious. And he doesn't back off this label of panpsychism. This is, for those that have been following the cognitive neuroscience history of consciousness studies, this should be a shocker. Well, notice the interesting thing about what he said. You could spin this integrated information theory either way. You could spin it as strong emergence, or you could spin it as panpsychism. Why does he accept the panpsychism thing? Why doesn't he just say, no, I'm not a panpsychist, I'm a strong emergence, and it's just a law of nature, like it or not, an inexplicably brute law of nature, that when a certain number of phi is realized, you know, then you have consciousness. Done. Give me my Nobel Prize. Right? Well, so one of the things we can ask about these, and of course the job that I'm going to undertake now is to beat up on both of these, and then I'm going to give you an alternative that after I've, you know, beaten up on these should look better, at least by comparison. So is one of these really superior to the other? Well, I want to say no. I want to say they're equally problematic and really not that different, even though one has, well, you'll see. So given the current conceptualization of matter, because nobody's changed the conceptualization of matter in this problem, right? So matter is still inherently non-mental. Even for the panpsychists in a weird way, right? Because you have some weird intrinsic proto-mental quality at the heart of it. So, but nothing else in physics has changed by this, according to this view. So it's a weasel, I would say. But anyway, plus COP, a technical term of art, that is the causal closure of the physical, right? What does that mean? To make a long story short, this is an assumption. It goes really back to Descartes' mechanism. Only in addition to saying that matter autonomously unfolds according to its own laws when not perturbed by mind, the COP principle adds to that. Many philosophers and scientists believe this, if only implicitly, that, and by the way, mind never does perturb matter. In other words, the physical world, for every physical event, and that would include biological events, there is some prior sufficient biological or physical event that explains it completely or determines it completely. You could think about that in terms of laws or causes, whichever you prefer. So here's the weird place where we find ourselves at. If you take this view of matter and you take this COP view seriously, which many do, then it seems like we're stuck with something like strong emergence or panpsychism as conservative options. Now, you might be thinking, well, why is that conservative, right? Well, it's conservative because of the history. And the history is that dualism is the bugaboo that nobody ever wants to embrace, that it has a certain reductionist or materialist view or physicalist view. So dualism is supposed to be the really crazy thing to believe, right? We don't want to do that. So these people who are trying to fall back on some position because they're afraid they're not really going to be able to explain conscious experience, right? And think about it, even if they did have a neural correlate of conscious experience, they would just have a correlate, right? That would be, at best, the beginning of a scientific explanation. You would need a causal mechanism. You would need a law. You would need something. And they're nowhere there. They're not even at the point of a correlate. So they're freaking out a little bit, and they're trying to hedge their bet. That's how I see it anyway. But they don't want to be, above all, they don't want to be dualists, because that's crazy, right? But panpsychism is, less crazy. So I want to say that both views are equally problematic. And they have famous problems associated with them historically. I'll take you through a little bit of it. So the panpsychism view, the proto-mentality at bottom. And again, remember, we don't even know what that means, right? What does it mean to be a proto-qualia? What does it mean to be like, well, particles don't really see red, but they have some, half a version of that. I mean, it's not even, we don't even know what it means. But anyway, so, and then the problem with that is called the combination problem, which is even if I grant you this, I don't know what it means statement, how does all that combine to make, robust, conscious beings and minds such as ourselves that have coherent experience? No answer forthcoming. Okay, so what about the strong emergence option? Any idea what I...
Yeah, just hit the red thing up there.
Okay.
The red circle.
Okay. Yeah. So what if instead I go with the strong emergence option? And I have these brute psychophysical bridge laws. That's how we talk about them. That's how C.D. Broad even talked about them. Or a brute causal process. Somehow brains just brutally cause minds under the right conditions. Well, the sort of negative punchline there is, well, then we have this sort of a miracle occur, right? I mean, there's nothing else like this. I mean, this is unique. So we allegedly have qualia either brutally popping out of brains, as in strong emergence, or we have something intrinsically qualia-like hiding at the metaphysical center of physical entities brutally combining to form mature conscious minds, right? Hopefully if I've done my job being pejorative and unfair, you're all like, yeah, these views suck at this point. And if there were defenders of these views here, I guarantee you there would be hands up and they would have things to say. So I want to be fair and say that. So with regards to the fundamentality of consciousness, I want to say, or conscious experience, it seems that the only big difference between strong emergence and panpsychism is over when and on what length scale axiomatic experience, or qualia, manifests itself in the life of the universe. So which do you want? Do you want something not quite qualia-like popping in at the level of fundamental physics? Or do you want it popping in at the level of brains, right? I mean, why don't the panpsychist people say, I'm a panpsychist, but I'm a brain panpsychist, right? What would there be any real difference there? So I want to say that it's even worse than that both views are explanatorily lacking, right? I want to say that not only do they not help, but they're really not that different. Well, see, why? First, because panpsychism needs strong emergence. So when you ask them, well, how are you going to get from these proto-qualia particles to, full minds, they tell stories about emergence, right? They fall back on emergence. So they need emergence anyway. And this one's a little harder to see, but strong emergence needs panpsychism also. In other words, it needs panpsychism in the sense that they're going to have to give up a little bit the idea that matter is essentially non-mental. Because if you really think that matter is fundamental, and you really think it's essentially non-mental, you can't really be a panpsychist. You're going to have to be a dualist. So here's my evidence. Tim O'Connor, very well-known philosopher, I don't know if he's been in this neck of the woods, is a big defender of strong emergence. And here's what he says. Where we have reason to believe that there are such metaphysically emergent capacities, it will be natural to suppose that they are caused to be by the object's fundamental parts, which have, key bit, latent dispositions awaiting only the right configurational context for their manifestation. So matter is somehow latently, consciousness producing. In other words, panpsychism. So it's not even that you have a choice between two sucky options. They're not even that different. And they pretty much share the same sucky problems. So just to be a little bit fair to Tim, because I know him, this is what he would say in response about strong emergence. It is sometimes suggested that there being metaphysically emergent capacities would be spooky, not amenable to empirical investigation. But this is simply not the case. While they are basic features of reality, emergent capacities may nevertheless be fruitfully studied and eventually explained in detail in non-reductive fashion. By spelling out the basic inventory of emergent properties, detailing the precision under which organized physical systems gives rise to them, and isolating the precise behavioral impact and their presence on the system. Reasonable enough as far as it goes. But I want to say, yes, it really is problematic. Why? Well, because for one thing, you still have a causal interaction problem, right? How do mind and consciousness and the brain interact? And that's been a problem at least since Descartes, right? And most of us do believe that our minds, our conscious states, and our intentional states really do cause us to do things and so on. How does that happen? How does it affect neurochemical states if you believe that the physical is causally closed? It's actually ruled out by the causal closure of the physical, right? You're saying that it's not the case. It's always some prior brain state that does the work. So that problem persists. Also, it violates unity. So some people embrace unity, some don't. But if you do, this is problematic because everything in nature coheres except for this singular and brute lone rule. In other words, the strong emergence only applies to consciousness, right? So it's the only brute fact outside of those in physics. This is the story they want us to buy, that the reductionist is right about everything except for consciousness, even about cognition and intentionality, but not consciousness. Consciousness is the lone holdout in this story. I personally find that, if nothing else, aesthetically odious. And I also think it makes it impossible to explain. So what makes this new law or causal process that apparently just pops into existence late in the life of the universe explanatory as to merely descriptive of a certain correlation? What is meant here by a cause or a law? What is it grounded in, right? It just seems like something that hangs outside of the rest of the scientific artifice and enterprise, and we just accept it, as one famous emergentist said, with natural piety. So, again, I want to say this really is problematic. So given the basic physical and biological facts, plus these new laws, or these new causal potentia, if you prefer causal talk, from essentially non-mental matter, because we haven't changed that part of the equation, there arises the essentially distinct kind of conscious experience. That strikes me as a tall tale, right? So, and furthermore, how is this more naturalistically plausible or explanatory than straight dualism? Why is this any less spooky than souls or, independent minds? It's not, surely an argument is owed there as to why it is. How is this more plausible or explanatory than the neural correlate picture that drove us from materialism to strong emergence in the first place? Isn't it really just the same picture under another name? No more or less explanatory? So what I want to say is, when it comes to qualia, I'm not at all sure that there's any real difference between the metaphysical, explanatory or metaphysical difference between materialism, the identity theory or the neural correlate theory, strong emergence, panpsychism, and property dualism. So these are all supposed to be metaphysically distinct philosophical positions that have their own advantages and disadvantages. But here's the interesting thing. They all still buy into qualia, this qualia conception of consciousness. They all still buy into an atomistic, a mechanistic, or materialist conception of matter. And they all buy into the causal closure. And I want to say, because they don't question any of these axiomatic assumptions, it leads to these positions that are all equally odious and maybe not even that distinct. That's what I want to claim. So let's go back. What's the master argument for strong emergence and panpsychism? How did we get led to this position? Well, here it is. Since the heart, and again, you have neuroscientists saying this now, some, although I think they're getting embarrassed. Since the hard problem can't be resolved by materialism, that is to say, science can't explain consciousness with only the resources and vocabulary of neuroscience or physics, then we should embrace strong emergence or panpsychism as the next most conservative alternative. So, if we want to get out of this, if, like me, you don't find any of these views satisfying, we need to deflate the hard problem, not just try to meet it head on, but we need to go back and say, what wrong axiomatic assumption led us down this primrose path? Let's go back and rethink it. And that's the only way that we're going to defeat this master argument, is we need another alternative. And it won't surprise you that I happen to have one. It's not mine, but I'm going to champion one. So as long as matter is conceived of as essentially non-mental and experience is conceived of qualia, we're stuck with strong emergence, panpsychism, or dualism. I would pick dualism over those myself. So we need an alternative that must reconceive matter and mind somehow. So this part is the part that I'm most trepidatious about. So as you said, I'm a philosopher of physics as well as somebody who does consciousness. And I want to talk about the matter side of the equation for a second. And I can't really do justice to this because this would be an entire talk. So this is going to be sort of like trust me kind of situation for a few minutes. So many of us have argued that quantum mechanics and relativity strongly suggest that the way that we typically conceive of matter is problematic. In particular, we shouldn't think of matter having intrinsic properties. So intrinsic is, again, a philosophical term of art. It means that if a property is intrinsic, it's a property that an object could have even if it had no relations to other properties. Like, as we say, in a possible world in which only this particle existed, right? If mass is an intrinsic property, then it would have that property of mass anyway. And we also tend to think of, again, this is really just atomism, right? We also tend to think of matter being some sort of primitive individual at bottom. Maybe you think of atoms, maybe you think of particles, or maybe you've heard of weird-ass stuff like strings or membranes, or I could get even weirder than that if you want. So we tend to think of matter like that. But in a book that's gotten a lot of attention called Everything Must Go by Ladyman and Ross, they argue, and many others have argued as well, that if you really take a look at physics, there's no reason to think of matter that way. And I'm making an analogy here for those that have not, and their view is called ontological structural realism, right, which I'll say more about in a second. But I'm just trying to give you an image here until I can fill this in a little better. So even if you don't know anything about graph theory, in graph theory we have relations, we have edges and nodes, right? And we build up nodes, the things that we would normally think of as being the atoms or the things. We can build those up out of the properties of the edges, which is what we would normally think of as the relations. I'll show you a picture in a second. But if none of that means anything to you, maybe you know something about Buddhism or Hinduism. I think there's a similar conception in the idea of Indra's net. Everyone has probably run across this once or twice, but you have all the, you have these infinitely, reflecting nodes and these relations, these edges between them. And then when you zoom in on the nodes, they're nothing but reflections of the other nodes. So it's like that all the way down, right? This is a fancy metaphor for impermanence in Buddhism, or dependent origination, if you like, which people who want to publish where I publish are never supposed to mention in the same breath with physics. So please just oh yeah, you're filming this, aren't you? Well, never mind. Screw it. So according to ontological structural realism, entities and objects and their properties are secondary to relational structure. So this is from Scientific American. As Kuhlman puts it, so proponents of ontic structural realism say we might as well dispense with things and assume that the world is made of structures or nets of relations. It's called ontological structural realism because structures and not things are fundamental. You can characterize structures more or less formally in terms of network theory if you want. Okay, so now I just want to give you my cheesy pictorial representation. So these would be the relations, the network, and these derived things would be the individuals. So things, entities, objects are not fundamental, but they rather, in my language, emerge from this net of relations. Right? That's the idea. And again, I would have to do an entire lecture on if I really wanted to try to convince you that this was, a reasonable interpretation or thing to believe based in quantum mechanics relativity, I would have to take you through that. Anybody's interested, I can point you to stuff. Now, the problem with ontological structural realism, this is an in-house debate that I won't bore you with, is it's still very physics-centric. It's still, it's not very pluralistic. It doesn't take into account the special sciences. It still has causal closure. It's still too physicsy. So myself and a colleague named Robert Bishop have cooked up another view that we call contextual emergence that has some of the same features as ontological structural realism, but I wanted to tip my hat to it. And it says that the properties and the behaviors in a particular domain offer some necessary but no sufficient conditions for properties and behaviors in another domain. In fact, properties, you can forget about this unless you're a philosopher who does causation. Properties and behaviors in a fundamental domain may not even provide necessary and sufficient conditions for that domain. So what does that mean? It means that there are going to be things at all different scales of reality, length and temporal scales, that have effects at all different other scales. So physics and the physical world is not causally closed. And there's all kinds of processes and relations that go on across what we think of as being closed systems. I'll give you more about this. So the idea is that contexts and relations at all scales are equally fundamental, and things emerge from the web of relations in certain contexts. There's no intrinsic properties. There's no causal closure, or dynamical closure if you prefer. No scale, level, or hierarchy is absolutely fundamental. Therefore, ontological reductionism is false. And the sorts of analogies that we make for the physical universe, like the game of life, get rejected. Let me talk about that, because that's a helpful analogy. So whether or not you're familiar with finite automata in general, you're probably all familiar with Conway's game of life, or you've seen it on your computer if you played with it. It has a few basic rules, right? And you have these rules, and it tells you basically when a tile or whatever lives or perpetuates, and then you get these grand patterns out of these three basic rules. And you get things like gliders and things that look like living patterns and so on. Call it a finite automata because it's just a piece of software that's instantiating three very basic rules about the life or death. Think about it as like Pente or Go, if you're familiar with that game, but on a smaller scale. And so that's how these reductionists and materialists tend to think about the physical world. They tend to think of it this way. So you have the Big Bang, you have some initial condition, and there's some fundamental law of nature. We don't know what it is yet. That would be what quantum gravity would provide, that unifies relativity and quantum mechanics. Now, whatever this fundamental law of nature is, it's just like those three rules in the game of life, in this finite automaton. And time evolves whatever the fundamental physical stuff is. And the theories about what it is have gotten very weird, much weirder than particles, right? So you have M-branes and all this crazy stuff that I won't bore you with. But there's some weird fundamental stuff, and there's some law of motion that time evolves it, and you get everything else for free. It's kind of radical. I mean, it's actually conservative in the sense that many, if not most, scientists and philosophers now believe it. But it's really radical in the sense that the idea is that the universe is sort of, not literally, although some people like Wolfram would say literally, is on an analogy with a finite automata, because everything, including the conversation, or I shouldn't say that because you're not talking, including what's happening in this room, World War II following World War I, everything, these large macroscopic patterns, you get them all for free just from that fundamental physical stuff. Okay, thank you. And whatever these fundamental laws are that evolve it. It's all just patterns in that. Now, most of us find that insane, right? And why would you believe that? But many people do believe it. So this contextual emergence is a rejection of all that. And not only is it a rejection of all that, but it says that's not the right implication from science. So contextual emergence rejects the very premise shared by strong emergence of panpsychism, this conception of matter that leads them to take those positions about consciousness. And I could give you try to give you lots of examples. That's what a lot of my work is about. But I'll just talk about, I'm going to have to speed through this part a little bit. So we've been applying this idea to physics, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And other people have applied it to physics as well. But the idea is, think about quantum mechanics. Okay, so without getting into any gory details, probably everybody's heard about wave-particle duality or quantum entanglement. In a wave-particle duality, you know that whether or not a quantum system behaves like, shouldn't think of it as literally being, but whether or not it behaves like a particle or a wave is a function of the apparatus. Are both slits open? Is one slit open? Is neither slit open? And so on. And so people like, Bohr, you may know very famously, in their own way, not perhaps as well developed as one might have hoped for, but in their own way were striving to say something like, well, wait a minute, you can't separate the quote-unquote quantum system from the macroscopic contextual aspect, in this case the slit and the detector, right? You have to think about them as one system. And in fact, there's no such thing as the quantum system separate from its macroscopic context. So, and it would take me a long time to argue for that is the right way to think about that. But I have done this in other work with other people. And it's a good example. And I would say that you can find many examples like this. I would say many biologists would want to take issue with me, but to give you something further up the scale that may be more intuitive, I would say that the epigenetic revolution is evidence of this as well, right? Before the Human Genome Project, biologists would literally look you in the face and say things like, once we work all this out, if we had a powerful enough computer, we could compute phenotypes from genotypes. Bullshit, right? What did we learn? We learned genetic determinism is false. We learned that context is equally important. In the cell, in the body, in the environment, mental context, cultural context, right? So we learned that the nature-nurture debate was silly because it's both, right? You can't separate them. So I would say there's a lot of examples like this. And this is what I mean by context is fundamental, right? Not some material stuff that we build everything out of like Legos or something. So, but what's important for the purposes of this discussion is this. If you look at matter in this contextual relational way that I've tried to sell you in the time that I have allotted, here's the important bit. Matter is not, on this view, inherently non-mental, right? It's not even inherently material in the old-fashioned senses of material. And matter has no intrinsic properties. So now we've solved half the problem, right? This hard mind-body problem, this hard problem, was about how we conceptualize matter and how we conceptualize consciousness. So we've reconceptualized half. What about the other half? How far can we get? Because the strategy that I used was this relational strategy. Can we apply that to conscious experience? It seems like that would be really hard to do, right? Because if there's anything that seems like it's intrinsic or entity-like, it's conscious experience, especially if we think of it like qualia, right? Like the intrinsic property of seeing red or feeling pain. Well, I would say we have William James to the rescue here. And lots of other, I could talk about Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and lots of other people. But I think James sticks out the most for me. And first of all, we have James who has this functionalism about psychology. And he was fighting against this other view that says all of the psychological activity, or what we now think of as computation and cognition, somehow goes on in the head, in the mind, right? And James said no, that the right unit of cognition is an agent in an environment reacting to the environment in a larger historical, cultural, and evolutionary context. And James also advocated the thing that I'm going to talk about more in a second, neutral monism. Sometimes also he called it radical empiricism. And the way that he would often put this is, and again, this is a rejection of this matter hierarchy and matter is fundamental view, that essentially what's real is what is experienced, which sounds, I'll have to say more about what that means. And finally, he championed this view that we call direct realism, which is a rejection of representationalism, which is essential to this computationalist kind of view. I'll say more about that in a second. So the idea is this. If you take computationalism seriously, if that's the mechanistic side of how we explain thinking, then you're stuck with qualia as this extra problem. So you have these two problems, the problem of cognition or content, and then the problem of phenomenology. And that's what led us down this road. And then you get all these odious solutions that people have tried to cook up over the years. But if we're not computationalists, if we are not willing to say that thinking can be explained mechanistically, if there's something problematic with that paradigm, we can do something different. So contextual emergence opens the way for, and I'm going to say is best characterized as neutral monism. So neither mind nor matter is inherently physical or mental. Neutral monism allows us to tell a relational story about mind, just as we did with matter. So skip that bit. So here's a quote from James. A given undivided portion of experience, taken in one context of associates, plays the part of the knower, or a state of mind, or consciousness, while in a different context, the same undivided bit of experience plays the part of a thing known, of an objective content. In a word, in one group it figures as a thought, in another group as a thing. So James is pointing out that one of the reasons we keep ending up at things like dualism or panpsychism or strong emergence or whatever is it's built into our phenomenology of everyday experience. That out there is the external world, nor ordinary everyday experience, right? You know, drugs and meditation, all that different story. But out there is the external world, and it's made of matter. And in here is me, you, I, the self, the subject, right? And I live behind my eyes, and there is this deep subject-object cut, and I'm a conscious being, and that's the material world. And what James is pointing out is, while it certainly seems that way, that is, to reify that, is to actually turn your experience into a philosophical position. You're making an inductive inference. So James says, my thesis is that if we start with the supposition that there is only one primal stuff or material in the world, in my view, don't think about that as substance. Think about that as just relations. A stuff of which everything is composed, and if we call that stuff pure experience, the knowing can easily be explained as a particular sort of relation towards one another into which portions of experience may enter. The relation itself is a part of pure experience. One of its terms becomes the subject or the bearer of knowledge, the knower, the other becomes the object known. So it's hard to, I mean, our everyday experience is so inherently dualist, it's very hard to wrap your mind around this idea, I think. So I'm going to call this fundamental neutral stuff pure presence. James calls it pure experience, but the problem is that makes you think of something mental right away, or it makes you think of sense data. So by using the language he did, he sort of ended up getting misinterpreted. But this is the idea, right? So the knower and the known are just two, I would say, aspects of these neutral relations, right? Subject and object are two sides of the same coin, not essentially different things. Here's how Russell put it. This one I think is more straightforward. But because Russell sometimes advocated panpsychism, it's a little problematic to use him as an advocate for neutral monism. But he was a neutral monist at times. And this is what he says. The whole duality of mind and matter is a mistake. There's only one kind of stuff. And again, you shouldn't, in my view, don't think of stuff, don't think of substance. These are old notions we don't need. Out of which the world is made. And this stuff is called mental in one arrangement and physical in another. Right? So whatever you want to think of as fundamental, it's not physics, and it's not mind, it's not matter, it's not material, it's neutral between those. And it has both of those aspects. So again, because of experience, we tend to carve the world at the joints in a certain way. We tend to think of physical and mental as being binary oppositions. We think of inner and outer as being binary oppositions. So when I close my eyes and I engage in mental rotations, I think of that as being inside my head. And I open my eyes and I think of that as being out there. And then we reify that distinction. Likewise with subject and object. But James's point and other people is that's not a datum. That's an inductive projection. So in other words, you're engaging in a metaphysical conclusion and you don't, neither science nor experience demands that of you. So another way to put it is that the hard problem is a cognitive illusion, right? Experience isn't inherently or essentially mental, and the external world isn't inherently non-mental. Here's how I would put it. Relations are fundamental and they are neutral. Everything else emerges from these relations or are patterns in these relations. So get rid of all these Lego metaphors like composition or determination or built up out of. That's all stuff that's the way to atomist things. But not here. These are networks of relations. And so instead of saying, as Ladyman and Ross do, everything must go, we say, no, everything must emerge from this network of relations. And it's also advocating direct realism. So there is no, we don't, in this view, that this neutral monist view, we're not mediating the environment with representations in the grand sense of representation with a capital R. I'm not saying that we never use representations of any sort, right? I'm saying that there is no layer perceptually, right, between us and the world. We interact directly with it. In fact, the world and us are one system, two facets of the same thing. So we don't, on this picture, where we are coupled with the environment, you could think about this mathematically if you wanted, like nonlinear coupling or something. We don't need representations to mediate our interaction with the world. So where am I in this picture? This is a takeoff on Dennett, of course. The phenomenological world of experience is neither in the head nor in the external world as nominally, meaning that in the Kantian sense, conceived. Neither is the self. Both are two sides of the same relational coin. What am I? Many other people have said this. Zahavi is a scholar, a phenomenologist and a Husserl scholar. And a lot of other traditions have tried to get at this idea. We can say that the minimal subject in the external world co-arise. You can't have one without the other. So there's a lot of people, existentialists, phenomenologists, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, by the way, Buddhism and Hinduism. I could find many, many, many other traditions that say similar things in a different way. But in my language, there's a self-consistency relation between self and world. So here's my cheesy, there's nothing deep about this. This is my cheesy way of depicting it, right? So we all know this Gestalt image. And I just use this to visually depict the idea that there's no self without a world and there's no world without a self. And maybe a way to try to sell this to some of you is to really think about the phenomena. I'm willing to take phenomenology seriously as a basis for my, making inferences about the nature of reality. So I don't know if, even if you're not a meditator or whatever, think about it. You go to sleep at night. Well, you go into deep sleep. And what happens? The self goes away and the world goes away, right? And presumably there's nothing left. And then you wake up. The self and the world come back online together. Two sides of the same coin. And if you meditate, if you have meditated in some tradition for a while, you'll notice when you get into a really deep state of meditation, this is where phenomenology and Buddhism meet, and there's a lot of literature about this, that the self goes away and the world goes away. The subject-object distinction goes away. There is something left over. I call it pure presence. You can call it, Hindus might call it the witness consciousness. You can also call it nowness. That feeling, that specialness, right, of the present moment. That's another thing about phenomenology we all know about. There's something special about the present, right? Like now, 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 right? Those other hand claps don't feel the same way, right? And going further back, you remember stuff, doesn't feel the same way. There's a special phenomenological thing connected to the present. And I want to say that that is fundamental. And I want to say that that's exactly what's left over when the subject-object system dissolves. And again, you can find this idea in many traditions. So now again, Kant says things like this, but he wants to explain this in terms of some category, right? Some filter in your head, okay? So he thinks that, that we're, it's canned. We have these categories of space and time and all these sort of things, and that's why we experience things in a certain way. And we just can't say anything about the noumenal world. All we can talk about is the phenomenal world as it's been canned by these, as a neuroscientist would think of them, some internal mechanisms or categories. And I think Kant is right, except for the story about it being internal. So if neutral monism is right, you can think about thought and mentation and conceptualization and all that stuff that we associate with the mental is on the same plane with clouds and trees, right? We impose a metaphysical separation of them as being categorically distinct, right? But you don't need to do that. The world doesn't have to be like that. And the same thing goes for Husserl. He's very concerned about the passage of time and the experience of time, and he proposes this inner representation of the passage of time. So he also, right? And he feels obligated to bracket phenomenology or experience, right? Because he's freaked out about science and philosophy and all that. And what I'm telling you is we should unbracket. We should have never separated phenomenology and experience from science to begin with. So the idea, again, is that the subject and the object and the world and space and time are both necessary and sufficient for one another. They co-determine each other. This is one system. So unlike Kant and Schopenhauer and Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, you don't need some internal mechanism, structure, something inside the head that does this trick. It's already the nature of reality. And again, you can find this being in time. I'm making these are quotes from Heidegger. You can find this kind of thinking a lot of places. He says, human life does not happen in time, but rather is time itself. Or that time is interwoven with consciousness. That's what I'm saying here. And I think that he's saying the same sort of thing that I'm trying to say here as well. He also said this, irrationality thrived when lived experience was excluded from science. And I'm saying this was the fundamental mistake that we made in the West that leads to all these odious schisms. He talked about everydayness too. I'm almost done. So hopefully, with all this in mind, we should be able to transcend Husserl's inner representations, Kantian categories, the poison of mind versus matter, inner, outer, subjective, objective. Not that these distinctions aren't useful in an everyday way, but reifying them as absolute. I hope that neutral monism is a conceptual antidote to that. Now, I'll end on this. I do think, though, I feel obligated to say that, this is a quote from William Seeger, that I think there's one thing that you can't weasel out of in this relational fashion. Because what I've tried to do is get rid of entities, get rid of substance, get rid of all these divisions, right, and relationalize everything. But I think, and this is what I was talking about when I was talking about meditative experience, and I think it's really what James was talking about as well. There's one thing left over. You could call it nowness or presence or presentness or whatever. But it's what gives reality reality, right? I mean, that sense of, that things are really happening. That nowness, right? And when that nowness is not part of experience, then you think of it as memory or not real or whatever. I'll stop there. Thank you.